Nikki, I love to start podcasts with just figuring out what you're drinking because I feel like everybody in the neurodiverse brain space always has at least one or two drinks around them. So, what do you have?
At least two in front of me at this moment. Yes, I am definitely one of those that likes to have my drinks all over the place and a multitude of them. Um, right now, I just have coffee and hint water in front of me. So I often start out my days with, a little bit of caffeine to help my brain transition into the waking world. And then I struggle with hydrating myself. And so I have found hint water to be one of the ways that I can stay hydrated. So it's basically just water with different hints of fruit depending on which one you have. And so, like I said, it just helps me to be more responsible.
So before we started this podcast, Nikki and I were chatting about how sometimes we just have to like pull the plug and reboot on things. And then also when it comes to my family, at least, my first question is, did you drink enough water today? And so we were kind of bantering back and forth about how we're good about asking other people about self-care and water. And so I love that you did take the initiative to bring your water today.
I did.
Um,
I did. I try.
yeah,
I put the
it's
effort out
not
there.
easy,
No,
right? Like our self-care is always takes a backseat, I feel like, to everyone else's.
especially if there's a lot going on, it is easiest to kind of put yourself last. And especially once you get into a great habit of doing that, I've been doing it all my life, it just becomes second nature, just to take care of everyone else around me. And I notice it with advocacy too. I advocate better for others than I do for myself. And so it's still a lesson in life I'm working on.
Yeah. Yeah, that it is so interesting. Well, just to give the listeners a little bit of background on you, Nikki is a accessibility design consultant. She's done amazing work with big companies like Accenture and other large companies in the accessibility space. And I actually heard about you, Nikki, from another podcast, and I just thought, I'm like, you have such an amazing story. We need to get your story out there more and honestly, have more people tap into you and your awesome brain. And so I'm so excited for our conversation today that you can kind of share with listeners and maybe give them a few tips and tricks, but also just how your brain works. Can you share maybe a little bit just to start off about like your differently wired brain and kind of how you're unique in that way?
Yeah. So I'm ADHD and dyslexic. I have kind of known about my dyslexia since I was, I think in high school, I was evaluated. And as typical for women, they completely missed the ADHD diagnosis, even though all of the signs were there. So I actually didn't discover the fact that I was ADHD until right around the pandemic when I was doing a lot of research for accessibility. And then I remember seeing a talk about invisible disabilities. And I just started to realize that, like, oh, yeah, I'm dyslexic. Like that is an invisible disability that I'm living with all the time. And as I started to do more research on neurodivergence, I started to realize that I'm ADHD. Like I always have been. That explains so much of my world, explains why I just never fit into the molds that I was expected to fit into. And it just kind of gave a new clarity to my life and how I work and operate.
Yeah, yeah. Was there one aha moment that you saw like on social media or throughout your research? You're like, oh, that's the final check on the checklist?
It was the podcast that I was on, the ADHD for Smart Ass Women, when I listened to their episode, Tracy's episode 100. It was the 100th episode, so it was like a recap of all of the other previous episodes. So it was short little clips, so it was perfect, right? Like I didn't have to listen to 100 episodes. I could just listen to this one episode, and I was streaming in tears as I was folding laundry. on the floor because I needed to listen to a podcast in order to be able to do chores. And I think that might have even been mentioned in that process, and talked a lot about like time and the way that we understand time. And just by the end of it, it just all made so much sense.
Yeah, so for listeners that may not be quite as educated on the time aspect of ADHD, there's something definitely called time blindness, right? So we don't necessarily experience time in the same way, and that can present in so many different ways. But the one I find that's so common is that, like, if we have a meeting at 3 p.m., we will literally waste the entire day getting ready for that meeting because we're afraid that we're going to forget it, or we will get so busy and hyper focused on something else that we lose all track of time and then just miss the meeting altogether. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. My entire morning was preparing for this podcast because, to your point, if that wasn't the only thing on my head, I'll miss it. I'll forget. Time just escapes my brain. So I have to keep it front and center. This entire morning was dedicated around making sure that I was taking care of myself, drinking my water, taking my meds, and doing all of that prior to getting on so that I was in a good headspace to have this conversation too.
That's awesome. And that is so helpful, right? Like, if you can kind of just mentally prepare for those type of things and give yourself the space, I think that is one of the best tricks that I've found for sure. Aside from Post-it notes and calendar reminders going off at every yes.
I can't. I have two cameras, and if I put on my other camera, you just see a litter of Post-it notes.
That's exactly. I have, like, I think I can count like 7 Post-it notes on my desk right now of different random things. So yeah, so time blindness is a very real thing, and almost this like object permanence. I'm not sure if I'm using the word correctly, but if we don't see it, it doesn't exist a lot of times as well.
Yep, I use it all the time, and it's not just objects. It can also be like emotions and like connections. Like I love my friends dearly, but if they're not in my immediate orbit, then I will kind of, it's not that I forget about them. It's not that I don't love them. It's not that I don't think about them, but it's just, you have to be kind of in this space of mine in order for me to, for it to be in my working memory.
And I know for my kids and for my husband, sometimes they're like, "You didn't text me all day," and I'm like, "Oh, shoot, you're right." And it's not like you said, it's not like I don't love them. It's just that they're not in my office with me, and so it's just not something that's on the forefront, and not that I don't even think about them all day. I just yeah, it makes for some awkward dinner conversations.
I think my family has gotten used to it. Like if I'm traveling, I'm not that great at keeping up with them and doing the check-ins. And again, to your point, I love them. I love all the text and the pictures that I get updated on how they're doing, but like it's not that constantly on my mind of, oh, this is this time that I should go check on them. Because I'm hyper focused on what it is that I'm doing at that moment. I think in ways it keeps us more present.
I agree, and I think we spend so much energy sometimes just trying to stay focused and stay present, right? And so it's that I can't also a lot of times balance what's externally in my peripheral world. And so, yeah, it's good for the people that I'm around, and probably a little disheartening sometimes for the ones that I see at the dinner table in the
Right. It's funny. Yeah. If I am with you as a friend, I will dedicate all in that moment and be your friend and do what it is that you need or what we need, right? Like even just being an accountability buddy sometimes, and I'm all in on that. But then when you're not around, I'm not thinking about checking up because it's not in my capacity always. It's kind of what's in front of me, what I'm working on, what I'm focused on. And then it's all I can handle.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, and that's great, right? Like, that absolutely has benefit and merit. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is an accessibility design consultant? What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have spent my entire career in the design space. So I started off as a visual designer and then moved into user experience design. And over time, and especially when I was working at Accenture, over time, I was working with a variety of different companies and different team structures and started to work more with ADA teams, which is Americans with Disabilities Act. And I just started to realize how much more there was to accessibility and how much I, just as a designer, can impact digital experiences to make them more inclusive for all people. And that's kind of the crux of what like a user experience designer is that we're designing for the user. It's very, or at least for me, I find it to be a very empathetic place that we're in, where we're kind of constantly thinking about the people that we're designing for. And and when we think about the people, who we're designing for, that includes disabled users too. And we just often don't think about that. We often don't consider that. And especially when I was going to school, that wasn't something that was taught either. We didn't learn about accessibility design or the needs of disabled users, about what they need when they're going through a digital experience, or even from a print perspective too, as a visual designer. So yeah, it's more than just my hyper focus at this point. It is a huge passion of mine. And I know a big part of it is spreading awareness and education, because there's not enough attention paid to accessibility.
So I kind of want to go back to like when you were in school, because that's such a good point of you weren't like, especially 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, like people weren't talking about accessibility the way they are now.
Yeah. I think even now too, like even though there's been more awareness around accessibility, I still don't think that there's enough attention and education around it, even now. But at least there is more than there was before. Yeah, it wasn't even a topic, wasn't even like a mention on a single day. Like it wasn't something that was ever discussed.
That's so interesting. So how did you learn about it? Like what was the process, since you didn't have like necessarily like a formal track to follow? How did you get here?
Um, so I like to think that I've kind of always been on this track without realizing it. One, because I am neurodivergent, so I think intuitively I design for cognitive disabilities, because my brain wants to make sense of what it is that I'm designing for. Right, especially when we're thinking about infographics and charts and whatnot. If I'm working on this and I want to, you know, beautify it, as was a term that was used early on in my career. It helps for me to understand what it is, what's the meaning behind it, what is it that I'm trying to convey with this. So as I started to do more of that and try to understand the content behind it, I realized that there are certain ways of displaying information that just didn't make sense to me. And so my brain's constantly trying to make sense of that. And I like to think that is my dyslexic side, of trying to take these complicated ideas and just simplify it so that it's easier for other people to understand. And so I feel like I have been kind of intuitively doing that for so long, that I didn't even realize that. I've also, early on in my career, I had a peer who came to me and told me that they were colorblind and that they couldn't understand the chart that I was working on. And that was just one of those moments that just really struck me. Because then it never crossed my mind before that somebody wouldn't be able to see colors the same way that I did, or understand the visuals that were in front of them. And so from that point forward, I started to uh, become a lot more aware of how I was labeling my graphics, so that even if it was printed on a black and white printer, that you still wouldn't lose any of that context.
That makes so much sense. So many things are printed in black and white. So even if you can see all the colors, so many times we don't print it out, or, like there's different mediums that you're looking at it. I never thought about that, but that's absolutely true.
Yeah, as an advocate and as like an educator now, a lot of what I like to talk about is that we don't always control the situation and the environments in which people are experiencing these creations, right? Whether or not they're digital or printed. So to be able to think through all of those possibilities and to design for accessibility, we're then kind of keeping in mind a lot more of those kind of situational disabilities.
That's amazing. I love it. As far as I would love, like for dyslexic individuals specifically, like what are the things that you kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're designing or maybe reviewing? Because I think you do some like website review too.
Yeah. Digital experiences overall, really. So it's websites, apps, PDFs, just kind of anything that's kind of digital content in general. When thinking specifically about dyslexia, I like to really break down content as much as I can. So I know for myself, if there's a big wall of text that is very intimidating for me and hard for me to get through. So anytime, unless you're actually reading an article where you're expected to have that wall of text, but in instructions, that's awful. That kind of gives me the sweats to think about. I have to go through this instruction manual versus breaking it down into bullet points or to lists and bolding the important content and, like just kind of going through and allowing it, making it easier for somebody to skim through the information and understand what is the message it's trying to be convey or how to follow these steps. So again, just trying to break down content so that it's easier to digest. And then I also love to think through of the visual representation too, especially for dyslexic users, including iconography and utilizing colors to help categorize different streams of thought and whatnot.
So can you explain iconography? I can't even say it, much less I certainly couldn't spell it, I'm sure.
Actually, I think it's one of the few that I can spell all right. Iconography. Yeah. So when I say iconography, what I'm referring to is, if you see a home icon on a website, which is usually like a house, or I'm looking in front of you where we're using a platform that has a mute button in front of us that has an icon plus the label. And so that is one of the best ways to be accessible, is to include an icon and the label. Because then when you're thinking about the different ways that people process information, if somebody is more visually oriented, that icon for the microphone is going to immediately hit for them. So someone like myself who's dyslexic, I'm not always going to be reading as much as I'm going to be looking for those visual cues. So I'm going to see that little recorder icon, and I'm going to go, okay, that's going to be for, mute. But then for somebody who isn't as visual and likes to read more, or, maybe there's other cognitive disabilities, having that label is going to be much more impactful. And especially when we're thinking about those that have visual disabilities and maybe rely on a screen reader to go through the content of a page, they have the labels read out loud to them versus the pictures, because they're not going to be as, the pictures aren't going to help them out as much as the actual label and the text will. And so they will rely on that information to give them the visual, their cues rather. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm referring to iconography.
Interesting. So, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but I also, I only heard about this term maybe 2 months ago, and I had to stop the person and be like, "Wait, what did you say?"
No, I'm glad you did. It's funny because I'm constantly talking to a variety of different people, and I always have to remember who my users are, right? Who my audience is, because they're going to understand different different words and different languages. And that's another thought when it comes to accessibility too, is the way that we present our information. So you want to think about who the audience is and if they are going to be experts at something. So if I'm talking to, if this was a podcast about user experience design, that wouldn't be a part of the conversation of describing what iconography is. But when we're talking to a more general audience, that is going to be very important to have those moments where we define what these terms are. So it is also an accessibility consideration. So I'm glad you did ask.
So interesting. And when you called that out, so yeah, so for those of us that you're on video, I might be able to put a little screenshot of what we're talking about here. But there's a microphone and then it says mute underneath it. And it's so funny. I never even saw the words until you just called it out because I only look at the icons. Because I mean, I will do anything at any cost to not read a word. And
Yeah.
because I'm very dyslexic.
So we have a saying just in design in general that like users don't read, like people don't read, and I always laugh at that because I'm one of them. Like, I also get frustrated that I'm like, oh no, it's right there in text, but I'm also the person who's not going to read that. So it's about so that's another, like back to that thought of designing for dyslexic individuals. It's kind of keeping that in mind that they don't want to read, and if somebody doesn't want to read as much as possible, how do you make that easier for them? So then that's what I was saying, like including iconography, bolding certain elements of content, and then also breaking it into bullet points or smaller chunks so that it's easier to skim through. So it's kind of redefining the point.
I love that. And I love how you made it all concise and just one wrapped up. And I keep thinking of emails when you're talking, right? So there I
Email.
when I was in corporate world, I would have a whole folder of like I didn't name it this, but it was long emails that I'm never going to read, right? Like literally it could be the most important thing in the world and it would maybe from like 7 to 7:30 in the morning, I had enough energy to try to get the context out of those. But if somebody were to send the same email, but space it out and bullet and bold the key terms, it didn't matter that I had to scroll twice as far to read it down. It just made more sense to my brain. And so I think yeah, I mean, we're talking about, websites and apps and different kind of maybe more external, but even when we're thinking about internal communications, this is so important for our listeners and for, HR teams who are trying to get across. I think a lot of our listeners are HR leaders or just business leaders. When they're trying to convey a message and they want people to read it, these are important things to consider when you're drafting these emails. And so much time goes into these emails.
Percent. Yes, absolutely. I can't, I, that resonates entirely for me. I used to have different folders that I would have everything broken. And if I could separate it by color too, I always kind of used colors to help me associate the different categories of my emails. But yeah, if it was super important information that was coming for HR, I can't tell you how many times I'd be like, okay, this looks important. Is it, like, and then just trying to read through the paragraphs, but it was too much. It was too overwhelming. But if it was broken down, very concise, very simplified, I think, I don't know if it's it might even be a combination of the ADHD and dyslexia that I like to be to the point, direct and to the point. And so, like, if this is something that I need to read, put that in the very top. Put it in the subject line, must read, or like, crucial, so that I know, okay, this is one not to ignore. And so, like, for me, just having those kind of cues and being much more concise with the message just helps me so much more to understand how I am supposed to react to this.
Yes, yes. It's just cueing the brain, right? To even those little like urgent exclamation points in some of like our email. It's just like, oh gosh, this is an extra trigger. And for the ADHD part of me, I'm like, well, this is exciting. Like this must be critical. I don't know if it's actually critical or not, but it's like that little exciting element that it's I don't know corporate excitement, I guess.
Depending on the type of, you know.
Or dread. You're exactly right. You're exactly right. Kind of back to like the internal communication, because I know a lot of companies also have intranets, right, for their employees to host documents and trainings and all of this great kind of resource container of information. Are there things that the businesses should consider when developing and kind of designing for an intranet with their employees?
A very interesting question, especially as I had mentioned, as being a consultant with Accenture and kind of working with a variety of different companies, a lot of different companies, and experiencing a lot of different intranets. I think it is hard to rein that in sometimes because there's oftentimes there's a lot less control about the information or what's being posted, because it is a little bit more open for anyone to be able to start new channels or new pages or whatnot. So there are things that I know or I've witnessed and I've seen where it does kind of get a little bit overboard. But I would recommend something that I did at my last company is that I put together some, like a page that was like accessibility for like internal communications, of just kind of things to consider, ways to structure your email. So like if you have an image in there that has text, if somebody is unable to read that text because of visual disabilities, or if or even if they have their email settings so that they're not showing the text or showing the images, they're losing out on this information. And so being mindful of how you are creating the content, and everything that we just said too about like creating bullet points is also something to be very thoughtful of when we're thinking about different communication styles. So I kind of put together some guidelines of general accessibility communication and of guidelines of that everyone could be aware of. And then I continued to go forward from there and added in links of how to be more accessible when using PowerPoint or Word, so that as we're kind of doing these communications, what's to be mindful of. And when you're presenting on screen, including closed captions, if you have that available, can be extremely beneficial, even, well, especially for those who are having any hearing impairments, but even for those that are cognitive disabilities like myself, like having those closed captions helps me to follow along in a conversation, because it's the ADHD and the dyslexia, honestly, of like constantly pulling me and in different ways. As we mentioned before, just trying to be as present as possible when there's presentation going on, putting my all into being as present as possible, but I need other ways to help me rein in that focus. And having closed captions allows me to read and then hear at the same time, which just helps the processing of information and helps me to stay more in tune to the conversation. So those are just some examples of things that I've kind of put together and how to be more accessible in the ways that our communications are. And then I spent a lot of time too, also just kind of researching different ways of talking about accommodations and the understanding of what accessibility accommodations might be out there, and talking about talking about disclosing disability too, which can be something that it's a very controversial subject, because oftentimes people that are disabled are scared to disclose for fear of being stigmatized or ostracized. And so that was also a big consideration of mine too, when kind of putting together all of this content and information for our internal teams, because I truly believe that if you're trying to bring accessibility into your company, it needs to be embedded into the culture as well.
I absolutely agree. There's so many times when I'm working with corporate clients and I really encourage them to just offer all of the accessibility, right? Because to your point about closed captioning, it doesn't mean that you have to have somebody who can't see as well in the room. It may be good for so many people that you don't know, and they may not know, right? Like there's
Yeah,
so many neurodivergent people who don't even know that they're neurodivergent. And so they don't even know what to advocate for at this
absolutely.
juncture. And so just providing that and giving them that option, even just making resources available and like, hey, here's where to get this, speech to text writer or whatever it is, without them having to go to IT and ask for permission or go to HR. It just breaks down those barriers, I think, so much.
Yes, and considering from like an ADHD perspective too, right? If I had to go to IT to kind of request something, and that is so many steps along the way for me to falter or for me to have kind of the emotions embedded into it, kind of just say, you know what, never mind, it's okay, I'll just deal without it. And so I feel like that happens a lot for folks. And so if we make these conversations and the information readily available, it's something they don't have to seek. And to the point of not knowing what you don't know, I didn't know that I was ADHD, but I was talking to somebody the other day that was talking about their accessibility accommodation in college. One of the accommodations was that the teacher always had to write down what the homework assignment was. They couldn't just verbalize it in class. It always had to be written. So posted on a website, written on the, on the whiteboard or whatnot. It just had to be written down so that they were aware. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like I could have used that accommodation, because there's so much anxiety about whether or not I interpreted something correctly, if that was the exact way that the homework assignment was, or if I wrote it down correctly. That had that just been, oh, we wrote down the homework assignment every single time, I just knew that I could, I just would have known I could have copied it off the board. And that would have alleviated so much more anxiety about me not interpreting the information correctly.
I love that, and as you're telling that story, I'm literally going back to I had one of the best leaders that I worked for, and we would have these, like, long 2-hour conversations, and they were great, right? They're these big brainstorming conversations, and we were gonna, like, solve the world's problems and do all these great things. But then afterwards, he would send me an email, and he would bullet out the action items that we talked about, and just so we knew that we were on the same page, because we probably talked about 45 different things, but there was like 5 that needed to get accomplished, right? But I could have picked any 5 of the 45, and so he just made sure, I'm sure probably not knowing, but knowing how my brain worked as a good leader would, the 5 things that he really wanted me to focus on, and then I had them in writing, and I went back to it so often, and I would actually use it as a checklist, right? Like, so that's such a great like a workplace improvement that doesn't need a formal diagnosis, but you can just do that with your team members.
And going back to time blindness too, right? Like, let's say we have a week to complete this task. I might wait until the very last minute to work on said task. And now if I have a question about it, I'm going to be embarrassed to ask any questions because I don't want anyone else to know that I've waited until last minute. But the beauty of my neurodivergence is I might spend 2 hours panicking and creating a week's worth of work. Rather, if I had spread it out throughout an entire week, it would have taken me all of that said week to create that, to create that same amount of work. So sometimes kind of waiting until that last minute, even though it's not not necessarily the best idea, it just sparks so much creativity and focus and motivation that we so desperately need sometimes. And so having, again, to that point, having that written down and having it all outlined there, I then don't have that nervousness of going back and having to verify if I understood what the task was correctly. I already have that. And then I could just worry free and just work on my assignment.
And as you're talking about this too, I'm thinking it was probably better for the leader that I was working with as well, because then he could keep track of what we agreed on and yeah, the dates and the times and like what all was included in it. And it really didn't take him much time because he wasn't as challenged with email writing as I am. And so just to kind of like, dump it out into an email was easy for him. It was easy for me. You're right.
Right.
Like that sense of urgency and critical, oh shit moments of like, I can bang out a ton of work in 45 minutes if I'm in a pinch. And it's usually pretty good work, which is kind of the blessing and the curse at the same time, is that like, it's not terrible work.
I'm telling you, sometimes it's even better than, like I said, than like, so, yeah, it's amazing. It is a blessing and curse of being neurodivergent, or at least our brand of neurodivergence, of being able to do that. And it, like I said, it's something about having that that motivation of being under the clock, I think really helps. It kind of it helps to do that hyper focus. And then of course during that time I'm gonna forget to drink water entirely, but I'm gonna create some amazing work during that time.
Oh, how that resonates with me, and I'm sure our listeners as well, because yeah, I won't go to the bathroom for 5
Yeah.
hours when I completely should have, or drink water or eat or anything else that I should be doing to take care of myself. I'd love to hear, do you have like a challenge that stands out that was one of like your work projects? It was just like the most challenging to kind of figure out and like get a really good solution for, that maybe had like, I'm kind of picturing like different elements of, if you're working with some, a team that needs like hearing accommodations and accessibility and sight, and how you develop and brainstorm all these together to make it make sense.
When it comes to accommodating for accessibility, or creating accessibility compliant experiences, it takes a team of people. If you're lucky, N- not all companies or all have the ability to be able to work with others, but when you do have that capability, it takes lots of minds kind of coming together, because there's no one right way of creating accessible experiences. And we're creating for humans, and so there's different ways of interpreting information and different ways to kind of experience a user flow or whatnot. So it's definitely a problem solving moment. And again, I'm going to go back to my neurodivergence. I think it's the dyslexia that kind of really loves that challenge of having a problem to solve, and knowing that there's not like one right answer, and being able to explore kind of different ideas. And so, especially with what I do with creating, digital experiences, one of the most important factors is testing with users. So you kind of, once you come up with a solution that you think might work, you then go out and you test that with as many people as possible. And again, if you're lucky, you get to test it also with disabled users, because that's so crucial to have their voice included in that process. And you get to see how others interpret it, because there might be something that you're so used to. Again, I'm going to go back to our icon discussion of having fun. So, like, for us, having that microphone is immediate. We understand that is for, that's going to be for the speaking, and so that's going to be mute. It's clear to us, we understand. But when you're thinking about either other cultures or other perceptions or whatnot, there might be others that perceive it entirely different. And the whole concept, or everything that we kind of discuss within user experience design, is like, the user is what matters. So it doesn't matter that the way that we interpret it was correct. Having a microphone for a mute, a microphone icon for the mute makes sense. But maybe for a certain culture or certain users, that doesn't make sense. And so it's not about a right or wrong, but it's just finding a solution that works best for as many users as possible. So testing really does help, because again, the way that you perceive information isn't going to be the same, and you kind of are clued into a lot of the informations too, because you're behind the scenes. You're that wizard behind the curtain, so to speak, where you kind of understand all the facets that are going into it, the business goals, and all of the different flows that you can use, or the information that is going behind all of this, that you're not seeing it from the same eyes as the user who's maybe experiencing this for the first time, or maybe they are a super user of a particular app or whatnot, and they use it all the time. And so they wanted to use it for a particular task, but you might be impeding that by the way that your design works. So it's I know that's a long answer, but it's really easy to say that there's like one right way to kind of achieve accessibility, because there's so many different paths, but testing with users is really the most crucial part. And then, like I said, working with others, it's part of the fun of it for me. Like, I get to work with developers who are often, who are also really excited about accessibility. So having those conversations about the different ways of coding an element so that it behave differently, and what is going to be the best outcome. But of course, there's always restraints, time constraints, resource constraints, just project budgets, deadlines, everything that you can imagine, politics, office politics, all of that goes into the project, and you're taking all of these elements and trying to find the best solution. And it's part of what I love about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, the whole thing is a challenge, right? Like literally, like every piece of it is a piece of the puzzle that you're designing. Um, and I can imagine you kind of touched on this right at the end, and I want to dig into it a little bit more. What if there are leaders that are listening to this podcast and thinking like, I want to do this. Like I need Nikki, or I need, we need to do a better job of this in the organization, but I don't think I have the support from maybe senior leadership or somebody within the organization. Is there any like words of advice or wisdom that you can give to kind of help them through that journey?
Yeah, yeah, that's such a great question. I spent so much of my career trying to advocate bottom up. And so, for anyone who's listening who's also doing that, my heart goes out to you, because I understand how frustrating, how quickly you can burn out, because it is hard to advocate from the bottom up. Really, it is best when it comes top down, when there is when it becomes part of the company mission to have this accessibility, or accessible culture too, right? Like embedding it in the culture and then out into public spaces too, like into their public website, their materials, their content, having that dedication towards that. I mean, that's really ideal. And so there are some companies, larger companies, who have started to dedicate resources and time and energy towards creating more accessible experiences. But unfortunately, I have found, at least for myself, that oftentimes there's some negative connotation that happens first. So lots of times it's because they've got sued for accessibility that they're now like, oh, we need to actually care about this and we need to focus on this. And it's a really hard battle, because honestly, accessibility isn't sexy. It's not, it's not something that that folks think of when they think about driving numbers, or increasing engagement for their sites. But when we think about it as a whole, and especially in accessibility community, it is something that we always talk about. That, like at least here in the United States, I believe it's 1 in 4. It's either here in the United States or globally, it's 1 in 4. And then the other one is 1 in 5. So it's one or the other. But of course, dyslexia, my brain's always going to mix it up. So which one belongs to which, but I know that those are the numbers. But 1 in 4 or 1 or 5 here, and one of the two here in the United States identifies as being disabled. But then what I like to think of too, but that's only those who identify as that. I lived with ADHD for years and had absolutely no idea that I was also one of those numbers. So I certainly didn't fill that out in my consensus report. Up until now. Now I do. So now I am one of the numbers, but I wasn't for such a long time. And then also, as we age, our eyesight deteriorates, our hearing deteriorates, all of that. So that's also something to consider too, from disability perspective. But so when we're thinking about increasing engagement, that is so many users that we are then excluding if we are not considering accessibility. And then with even something as simple as colorblindness, I believe the number is 300 million people have a form of colorblindness. And so that's something that just, at least in every company that I've ever worked for, I've had at least one person disclose to me that they were colorblind. That is not even company. I should reiterate. I'm pretty sure it's every project that I've ever worked on. There was at least one person that I worked with that was colorblind. And so if we're not considering that when we are creating documents and charts and whatnot, we're excluding those users from that content. And one of my favorite examples for that, because I see it all the time, is just like a status report page, because we're always using the stoplight colors, the red, green, and yellow. And that is the number one most problematic deficiency, or I don't know if problematic is the right word, but that one's like problematic as far as the color scheme goes. Red and green is one of the top issues when it comes to colorblindness. So when we're constantly using those colors to convey meaning alone without a label, like we go, I've had it where it's like, here's the slide, our project is, and then you see a little green circle. And then that's supposed to tell everyone that the project is good, it's on track, we're on time, we're meeting deadlines, all of that. But if somebody is colorblind, then they're not going to understand that little circle on the top right-hand side is good, because we're not including iconography or labels along with it. And so that's just an easy way of we can still use the color, but then also adding labels and iconography to help differentiate so that everyone else can participate.
That one actually really hit. So my father is red-green colorblind, can see the other colors, or he jokes that everything's a shade of gray. But so we're not really sure what he sees. but you're right. Like, I've been in so many meetings where it's been red, yellow, green, right? Like on track, off track. Like, it's just very cut and dry. And I've never given a second thought to, like, if my father was sitting next to me in the same meeting, which he very well could have been, he would have no idea what's on track and off track. So, like, I'm picturing, like, maybe like squares versus circles, or like exclamation points, like some type of like that iconography that could help.
Absolutely. You just want to be able to add in different ways of perceiving the information. So, and again, thinking about that, if I'm printing this out on black and white, a black and white printer, am I going to lose context? Well, if you just have a circle that's green and that's supposed to convey all of this information, well, yes, as soon as I print that out on a black and white printer, you have no idea what the project is, if it's on track or not. And so, yes, including iconography. So maybe it's a green check for, good, or different shapes. So circles for good, squares, and you can, again, still utilizing the color, but then having that differentiate. Nope, not going to be able to say that. Having that to differentiate it with. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. You got there.
And then, or including labels, green, good, or green, passing, or on track, or whatever, so that even if you cannot see that color, you're still able to convey that information. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, for those that have visual disabilities or even cognitive disabilities that rely on screen readers, then having that label is going to be read out loud. So like, if it's on track, it's going to say on track, and then you don't have to necessarily, then that image just becomes, that green circle just becomes an add-on. It just helps the dyslexic or visual people to have this extra way of perceiving that information. It just helps to, work with all different types of brains and perceptions.
It's perfect. And even when you're mentioning the aging population, right? I mean, I say aging, I mean, I have most of my 40-year-old friends need readers at least, right? So it's not like I mean, aging is like in air quotes here. It's not even, right?
I've definitely noticed my hearing is not the same, and my vision is definitely not the same too. I've now the person at the dark bar with my flashlight or my phone going, oh my God, I can't read the menu.
Just mild changes in our eyesight or hearing, or even sensitivities to things and different color sensitivities that maybe didn't bother us before, or more kind of jarring maybe than they used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another big focus is color contrast. So we want to make sure that the color contrast ratio is, it is accessible and is compliant. So for an example of that, if you have yellow text on a white background, well, even if I have great eyesight, that's still going to kind of disappear on that background. And then if I have it on my phone and I go outside and I'm out in the sun, then that completely disappears. I can't see it at all. So making sure that you have the right color contrast, and that's just kind of the difference between that foreground and that background color with your text, is vitally important as well. So again, back to my example with like looking at a menu in a dark bar, if it is, a dark gray text on a white background, I'm going to be able to see that a whole lot more than if it is light gray on a white background. Then that is all going to disappear to me when I don't have the proper lighting. And so that's when we're thinking, what we talk about when we're talking about like temporary and situational disabilities, of the situational disability being that the lighting isn't what it should be at this moment. And so then therefore that's kind of causing a situational disability for me, where this text now is completely fading into that background. But when having proper color contrast, it's going to help me a whole lot more to be able to read that text.
Yeah. I don't know who doesn't have situational, right?
Well,
Disabilities because
that's the point. Yeah. Everybody is going to experience a situational disability at some point. So I have a phrase that I use all the time that said accessibility benefits all. So that if we're designing for accessibility, then we're going to benefit all users in these situations, and whether or not it's a situational disability or a temporary disability or a permanent one, you're kind of helping out all of those users by designing for accessibility.
yeah, no, that makes so much sense. And I'm so curious on the dyslexia side of things. Are there certain fonts that we are more I have my favorite, so I love Comic Sans. Like, I don't am I saying that right? Did I switch those 2 words around? I'm not
Good, good. It is Comic Sans. No, I'm laughing because in the design world, it is probably one of the biggest jokes is the Comic Sans font. It is loved to be hated. But however, for dyslexia, it actually is a really easy font to understand. So I do find that absolutely fonts are a big piece of it, and just a big piece for accessibility in general too. Like you don't want to use a font that's going to be heavily decorated if you're going to put like a lot of text. If you've got a paragraph of text, reading a paragraph of text in a scripty handwriting font is going to be very difficult to read. But if you have one or two words, maybe that's fine. It's a lot easier. It's less lift to kind of read through that. So proper choosing the right fonts is definitely a huge part of our consideration for when considering accessible design. And there are a list of fonts that are known to be easier to read for dyslexic users. And a lot of them are ones that, again, just like being intuitive throughout this entire time, are ones that I've always picked for all of my projects and had no idea until I started to see the articles come out about like the right fonts for dyslexia. And I'm like, oh, these are all the same fonts that I've been using throughout my entire career. Like, branding whole companies utilizing this font that was dyslexic friendly. No, I've never used Comic Sans professionally. I have used it for jokes though. um, oh, it's a good question, and off the top of my head, of course, every name is escaping my brain. Um, but so for dyslexia, it is said that a sans serif font is usually better. So sans serif is basically when if you think of Times Roman, which is very typical for when you're creating documents, especially in Word. I think it might or was at one point a default font. Of when you first opened up a document that it would be in Times New Roman. I'm not sure if it still is or not, but so sans serif or serif fonts rather are like when you have the little decorative elements on the kind of like on the edges of the font. So like a T will have like the little like slopes that come down, or the little angles that come in. So that is that's a serif font. And so sans serif font is the fonts that do not have that. So such as Arial. So if you think of Arial versus Times New Roman. So Arial, I believe, is a nice, legible, easy font that is kind of generically easy for everyone to understand. And then also easy for people that are dyslexic. But a good consideration, if you really want to dive into it, is that you want to have differentiators between certain letters and numbers that are similar. So if you think of B and D and P, because dyslexic people were not linear and see things kind of three-dimensionally. And so this is oftentimes why we also switch things around in our heads, is because they don't kind of live in this linear space, this 2D linear space in our head. So a B can kind of rotate and become a P, or like flip around and become a D. And so if you really want to pick a great font, you kind of pay attention to those letters and make sure that there's a subtle difference between those, so it's easier for someone that's dyslexic to differentiate between those.
That's awesome. It reminds me when my daughter was younger, her name's Brooke, so poor girl, I named my daughter Brooke, who's dyslexic. But she would always be it would always be okay if I actually, I think I made it an accommodation in her 504 that she could always write her B's and D's capital or lowercase, because like the capital B doesn't get flipped around as much as a lowercase b and a lowercase d. My son, literally to this day, like he knows all the tricks with the pigs and the dogs and the, whatever, the B's and the D's, but he still struggles with the reversals.
I have heard of people like putting out their thumbs, and then like I don't remember what the trick was for that. There's something with a bed. I don't. None of those were ever taught to me.
To be honest, I've heard them all so many times. It's still like when I like look at, like, they're like, just look at your L. I'm like, neither of these look like L's to me. Like, I still, and for those of you who aren't seeing the video right now, like I have like two right angles with my left, and right hand. Neither one looks like an L. Like the- I look at people like, I know you're trying to help and I appreciate it, but goodness, like, we're no further ahead. Like, let's just skip on to the next topic.
When I was trying to teach my daughter the difference between her right and left, the way that I've always been able to differentiate it for myself is to say I write with my right hand. And then that's how I figure out the difference between right and left. Well, I went to go explain this to her, and at the time she was ambidextrous, but like mostly left-handed. And I was like, you write with your right hand. And I went, oh, no, you don't. It's like, I don't know how to explain. I'm lost now. I have no idea how to explain your left versus your right. I'm like, the one that you write with is going to be the opposite of the right. But for me, sometimes learning things the opposite way, and I know this is my dyslexia, but like if I think of something and I'm like, oh, I've got this opposite, that this doesn't belong with category A, it belongs with category B. Well, I remember it that way then, that my first instinct is wrong and it's the opposite of what I think it is. And so it worked only for so long, because then eventually I forget what my first instinct was. And then I completely forget which one's the right one.
Oh, I think I did. I am trying to come up with an example, but I absolutely agree. I remember it in the reverse. And then, like, it's so long, but then I start to confuse myself. I'm like, well, am I remembering it in the reverse or am I remembering it in the right order?
Right. Like I do it all the time. Like, like this is the way that my brain wants to spell this word. But I know that my brain got it wrong because that's what it does. So I know when I have that thought of this is how it is, then I correct it to this. And that's just kind of like the constant mental gymnastics that we're doing in our head to just output information.
Yes, all the time, right?
Yes.
It reminds me, I saw a LinkedIn post of yours not too long ago, and it literally made me laugh out loud because you were calling out like the never knowing how to spell convenient. And I feel like I could probably have like put like 30 words on that list of believe is one, initiative, like literally guessing every time between the I and the E. Yeah.
The only way that I've ever learned how to spell people is by saying in my head people. And if I don't say it in my head that way, I don't know how to spell it. We're very phonetic learners, and the English language just is not.
Yeah. I do the same thing with beautiful. And I think it came from like a Jim Carrey movie, but it was
Beautiful.
like, yeah, like beautiful. And I like for that. But then my mom, all growing up, she would be like, okay, let's try to like catch a jingle with this one and make it up. And poor my mom is such a saint. Never stuck. Like she'd be like, remember we have this jingle, like still to this day. She's like, remember? I'm like, nope, don't remember that one.
She remembers.
She remembers. And Thursday, I spell Thursday correctly. Still to this, I'm like February and Thursdays. I don't schedule meetings in February or on Thursdays because I can't spell them right.
I panic inside if I have to spell things live in front of people without like or even with an autocorrect, just so that they can see the way that my brain initially wants to spell out things before it gets corrected. Yeah, it gives me panic inside.
That's actually one of the things that I always encourage leaders. If you're like having somebody write on a whiteboard, like just ask for a volunteer because you're never going to get a dyslexic that will volunteer to write on a whiteboard like live. Like I'm literally showing you how my brain actually works in real time, which is probably scary for most of you. And so, yeah, I always say I'm like, or especially typing if it's like a shared screen, I'm like, just ask for a volunteer. But yeah, some of us will never volunteer for that.
I've also been in spaces where I'm like, I'm dyslexic. I'm not the person to do the live note taking. Because also the way that I write notes is different, because it's for my own interpretation of my brain. So it's not written, like the way that live, in the moment, the way that I'm going to write out notes it's going to be like keywords. It's going to be how I associate those keywords with information. And it's going to look very cryptic to anyone else but myself. And so I am always asking for volunteers to do note taking because I know that I'm like, you're not going to understand my notes if I'm the one that's doing live in real time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And mine always have gaps of like ADHD zone out moments too. I'm like, oh, totally missed that whole point.
I was thinking of this really awesome idea.
Like, I just had a new business idea and I want to share it with you guys. And they're like, we're in a totally different meeting, Nancy. Oh, gosh. Speaking of business ideas, I would love to kind of just hear more about your company, the name of it, Scallywag. Am I saying that correctly? Okay. Can you tell me, like, well, one, what you do within Scallywag, but also how did you come up with the name? I'm so curious.
Yeah. The name is a fun one. I'll start with that. So I decided to start my LLC last year, and then it wasn't until the beginning of this year that I started to put my all into entrepreneurship. So I'm still pretty brand new at this. And when I first created my LLC, I picked a name that I realized afterwards could be a trademark issue. So I had to come up with a name like in a day. And so I was talking to a friend of mine and we were joking around about different words that have ally in it. So A11Y is the abbreviation for accessibility. And as you can imagine, for somebody who's dyslexic, accessibility is a hard word to spell. There's a lot of C's, a lot of S's. It's very difficult. And so there are 11 letters in between A and Y. And so that's why it's abbreviated to A11Y. And then also, isn't that cute? Yeah. And so also sometimes referred to as ally. I myself refer to it as ally. So I was looking for different words that had ally in it. And I, asked ChatGPT to come up with these responses, and Scallywag was on the list. And I just started laughing to my friend. I'm like, how ridiculous is that? Scallywag. And then we just started to think about it more. We're like, oh, well, pirates are always known for being disabled. There's a hook hand and an eye patch, and we were just like, oh my God, that's actually amazing. And then we were thinking through it even more, and I just, as someone who's neurodivergent and always going against the grain and always having to advocate bottom up and to be bold and to be outspoken and to be that person kind of leading the way, I just kind of felt like a pirate. And so, and then the more that we talked about it, the more you're just like, no, that has to be the name. That's it. That's the name. Scallywag. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback on it. One of my favorites is I handed out my business card to somebody that, was a potential client. And as I was walking away, I heard, pirates! Because I've made mine, a bit of a pirate themed. It's been fun. I'm really happy that that's the name that I came up with, and I enjoy the story too.
I love it, and I think it piques curiosity, right? Which is what we're known for, right? Is that
Right.
curiosity. So yeah, there's so many fun ways that you can take that. So I love it. Okay, so what does Scallywag do, and how and why should listeners kind of reach out to you, and how can you help them?
Yeah. So as I said, I have a wealth of knowledge when it comes to creating accessible digital experiences, whether or not that's apps, websites, PDF documents, data visualizations. And as I start to market myself, I'm even starting to learn more about how to market, even more accessibly as well. So even with social media and whatnot. And so that is my focus and my passion. And what I do is I help to consult other teams on how to be accessible in their digital experiences. And I am an IAAP certified professional in web accessibility, meaning that I've got the expertise to kind of back up my claims here. But one thing I think is very important is that even though I am an expert, I am not the expert. I still talk to users and want to test out designs and make sure that I am including the accessibility community so that, as technology changes, that we're still aware of the people that we're designing for. And
Yeah.
so I can help at any stage of the project. As I said, I was a consultant with Accenture too, so I'm very often used to being dropped in at any stage, whether or not it's the end of a project, the beginning of a project, or somewhere in the middle. But if you want to do it the right way, I definitely recommend that accessibility needs to be thought of from the very beginning at the concept stage and have that understanding of what it means to create accessible experiences and carry that forward throughout the entire process. I also help to educate product teams too. So that was something I did a lot in my past companies, is that I wanted to help my team members be more aware of the needs for accessibility. So I've worked a lot with creating training guides for developers, for other designers, product managers, content teams, and whatnot. And like I said, even creating internet resources to make sure that accessible communications are also being thought of throughout that process. So I do education, I do training, and I'm also a keynote speaker.
Wow. What don't you do?
I
It sounds like everything.
right.
Just reach out to Nikki and she will most likely say yes. Can we safely
Yeah.
say
Oh,
that?
yeah. Right. Yeah. Can you believe there was a time that I didn't think that I was ADHD?
Oh gosh. So as we wrap up, and I know we're coming up on time here, but I would love to know if you could kind of go back and tell, 10-year-old Nikki, who was maybe a little bit more challenged in school than some of her peers, and now looking at where you've come, which is just remarkable and impressive. And I know that there's so much more ahead of you. What would you tell 10-year-old Nikki?
Oh gosh. That other people's perceptions of you uh, are stigmatized, right? That I think that was such a struggle for me, was especially as, a dyslexic learner, was that realizing that I learn differently. And I think at that time, I was very much looked at differently. Like I didn't understand the context, or like I didn't understand the conversation. I couldn't follow along. But my thing is that I had to learn everything in order to work backwards and figure out the simplest problem, to solve for. It was especially that way with math. Like I needed to learn everything about it so that I can understand how to add, even just something as simple as that. And so, it would have been wonderful to have an advocate for 10-year-old Nikki to say that that's okay, that it's okay that you learn that way. And sometimes you're better for it. And that there's strengths in learning things differently and seeing things differently and having different perspectives. There's strengths in that. And that it is great to be in environments where you have all different types of thinkers kind of working together. And that the way that you think is going to be a strength for you.
I love that. I love that. Well, certainly it's clear to me, and I'm sure to our listeners, that the way you think is absolutely an asset and your gift to the world. And I love that you're helping other people achieve their gifts through more accessibility. So thank you so much for everything you do and sharing so much wisdom with us today.
Thank you.
And we will certainly leave all of your contact information in the show notes so people can get a hold of you. And certainly I encourage you, if you're looking for anyone or just want to even have a chat and see if Nikki can help out your organization, even if it's a nonprofit. I mean, everybody needs accessibility with everything that we're doing these days. So I encourage you to reach out to Nikki. And thank you again so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been a
Awesome.
lovely chat.
Awesome. Well, that is it for this episode of the Dyslexic Maverick Podcast. Until next time, friends, take care. Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, I would love it if you would consider subscribing. It is literally the best way you can support our work here. And if you're feeling extra generous, take a screenshot and tag us on social with one of your takeaways from the episode. Until next time, friends, embrace that unique brain you've been given.